Welcome to episode 8 of the IEL Collective Conversations, a series of conversations in which we try to make sense of how law intersects with the global economy. And we've been focusing since the start of this series primarily on the intersections between international economic law and the COVID-19 pandemic. But we hope to branch out into other sort of areas, raising other issues of concerns relating to the international legal architecture governing the global economy and the use or abuse of the global resources. And I guess today we can start a little bit of, on this by branching out into kind of another area of international law that commonly neglect as featuring, in our conversations about the governance of the global economy. And that's kind of on a broader set of global challenges that have been attenuated by the COVID-19 pandemic, but also raise a whole host of other issues in regards to national and global responses. I think what we would like to do today perhaps is to look at how, the sort of global and national responses to COVID-19 can, pose lessons to be learned from in terms of dealing with crises in what we call the global commons or the governance of the global commons, right? So today I have the pleasure of welcoming two really eminent guests to discuss the relationships between the intersections of COVID-19 and the global economy and the governance of what is called the global commons, right? So my name is Celine Tan, and I am a reader in law at Warwick Law School in the UK, and my research focuses on the intersections between international economic law and development, with a particular focus on financing for development. And I'm joined today by Vice Yu and Mariama Williams, and I will let them introduce themselves. Vice.
Thanks, Celine. So my name is Vice Yu. I'm right now I'm a senior legal advisor at the Third World Network. Before that, I used to work at the South Center together with Mariama, and even longer before that, I used to be at Friends of the Earth International. I'm a lawyer by training, like Celine as well, and I think a big part of the work that I have been doing over the past couple of decades or so has been really working on this the intersections of economic policy, macroeconomic policy, and development and environment, both including at the South Center and at Friends of the Earth, and now at Third World Network. And so I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm pleased to be in this conversation with you, Celine, and with my good friend Mariama.
Mariama?
Hi, good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. My name is Mariama Williams, as Celine said. I work at the South Center. It's an intergovernmental think tank of developing countries. And I work on a variety of issues on international development issues, including sustainable development, climate change, gender. And I'm also a member of the Caribbean Feminist Action Network, which is looking at these issues from the point of view of the Caribbean as a small island state. I'm an economist. I have a long background in dealing with international trade issues, gender. Now I work a lot on climate finance, gender and climate change, and all of the climate change and economic or climate change and development issues are the things that I'm interested in and work on.
Thank you so much, Vice and Mariama. So, like we said earlier today, we would like to kind of focus on the intersections between international economic law, global economic governance, and the governance of what we call the global commons, which I guess is defined, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong. It's kind of defined as parts of like the globe, the planet, which kind of fall outside the purview of individual national jurisdictions, right? But it can be accessed by everybody, right? And I think the United Nations and international law kind of defines like 4 broad areas for the global commons: the high seas, atmosphere, the Antarctica, and outer space, right? And this is kind of like referred, I guess, in that sense, the common heritage of humankind, I think. Let's put it that way. Now, so I want to, like just invite you both, starting with Vice, and then we'll go on to Mariama, to kind of define a little bit about, give a background to the kind of like legal and political architecture we're talking about when we talk about, like the global commons, and then we can have a discussion about that.
So who wants to start off?
You go ahead, Vice.
Okay.
You have the legal and political sense of this much more than I do.
Yeah, I think the traditional way of looking at the global commons are those like 4 main areas that you were talking about, Celine. But I think when we talk about the global commons, we're talking about, say, in the environmental context, sort of like the broad ecosystem parameters under which, for example, the global economy would operate. And so that means that we would be looking more at, say, how international frameworks or international institutional and policy arrangements are created for things like climate change, things like the ozone layer, or the oceans, or biodiversity, which in many ways can and should be considered as a global commons, even if most of the biodiversity are within national territories. Things like how we how we deal with transboundary issues. Those could also be considered as commons issues. So when we talk about the governance of the global commons, I think this is really more about what kind of frameworks do we create as a global community to try to regulate and ensure the protection and the conservation of these things in a way that would be sustainable, and in a way that I think also supports, if you look at the treaty instruments that are out there, also supports in many cases the development aspirations of the countries, especially the developing countries that are there. So if one looks at, say, the governance framework of commons issues, one really looks at sort of like protection and conservation and sustainable development and use and exploitation of those, which in many cases is very much the opposite of what you see now in international economic policy, which is like the policy frameworks that we have there on international trade or international investment, or on, say, even tax, which are more focused on how do you craft institutional arrangements and economic policy arrangements applicable at the national level that could maximize extraction, say, of natural resources, or maximize the ability to get benefits out of a particular commons area, and feed that into the traditional national economic accounting system so as to boost GDP and all those kinds of things. So there seems to be an inherent tension between these 2 regimes, I would say, which I think we might want to look at if we want to have a more maybe robust, more integrated and more systemic approach towards linking these 2 broad multilateral areas of policy, so that when we hopefully move out of the immediate, for example, pandemic response phase that we are in, towards a post-pandemic, say, recovery phase, we would be able to look at these 2, say, different multilateral regimes and think about, okay, how do we create it so that we are, in fact, as you were saying, Celine, learn from the lessons of pandemic reaction, and even finance crisis reaction that we had back in 2008, 2009, and then apply that to what we know will be coming down the road. We know, for example, that climate change is here and it's going to accelerate even more. We know that biodiversity loss is also accelerating. We know that oceans pollution needs to be stopped. All of these are crises which actually have in them the seeds of further crisis, including further pandemics. So it's really a question of, okay, well, how do we think about now global governance broadly, and especially global governance where we are able to link both the economic sphere, the environmental sphere, the sustainable development sphere together in a systemic and integrated way.
Thank you so much, Vice. That's really comprehensive. Mariama, would you like to expand on what Vice is?
Well, the danger, and one of the reasons I wanted Vice to go first, because I think he would frame it very nicely with all the comprehensivity and the scientific basis and the legal basis, which I don't necessarily have at my disposal. So I agree fully with all of that. I think at the granular level for your listener, we are really talking about those essential resources, right? We're talking about forests. We're talking about food. We're talking about water. We're talking about all of those resources that, yes, are not the domain of one particular state, but even within the state. And I think one of the COVID lessons we're going to learn, is that public health will probably have a global dimensionality to it, because we now have pathogens and viruses that don't stop at border. But currently, even the widening of the global governance framework to include things like migration, for which we don't have yet systematic set of rules. So we have systematic sets of rules for the 4 things that you named. Law of the sea, we have things about the atmosphere, we have various climate convention, and the environmental convention will cover some of the Antarctica issue and other kinds of issues. But there are other emerging dynamics around global governance which we don't yet have significant levels of rules, and which we have tension on. For example, if you take climate change and you look at where currently forests are, and forests we know are sinks and stuff, where are they? They're in many African countries and some Asian countries and some Latin American countries. Now, there is tension when we say countries, you can't exploit your resources, right? You must do a RED program or XYZ program to conserve the forest for mitigation, for global mitigation benefits. But those are under national domain, but there are still international pressure coming at countries. I mean, we see it for many African countries who now have discovered oil or other kinds of things in the Caribbean. We're still looking for oil. Who then, when you have found these resources, people will say, oh, you cannot exploit them on the grounds of climate change. Now, we accept that climate change is a global public bad, and the need to address it is a global public good. For climate finance, for example, I would argue, is a global public good. Is that a global commons? A lot of issues that have debate about these things. So I think even this notion of global commons is going to have to shift a little bit, dance a bit with the realities on the ground. And that reality of the ground, of course, COVID-19 have brought it up, but you already flagged the 2 framing concepts or tense concept within this global governance debate. One is the common heritage of mankind argument, and the other, of course, is the strategy of the commons. We can argue that despite this acceptance of the global, the common heritage of mankind, and despite the various frameworks that have been put in place, the tragedy of the common is still going on. And it's increasingly, and I think COVID-19 and other diseases and viruses that will come will show that tension between human systems and natural systems are definitely conflicting, and definitely will be producing a lot more of these kinds of events. And that's not the climate change extreme weather event or the slow onset event. So we have a whole other dimension of things that are coming, which will bring into this notion of what are global commons, things like public health, things like food security, things like how do you deal with border issues under those kinds of decisions, what is a border, and how do you, so I think a lot of things need to be unpacked in this whole discovery. And I'm interested to see how the IR, international relations discussions, will be pursuing some of these and some of the legal framework of this. I mean, at a practical level, I was listening to your one of your podcasts on the investment law. And the idea is that after this COVID, or even during this COVID process, which will be going on for a good 18 months, I think COVID will have a long shadow on the global economy. I mean, we see that it's just picking up in many developing countries, but even despite the particularities and the aftermath of the disease itself, in terms of the health crisis, there's an economic crisis, right? There's a debt crisis got to be associated, and we might even have climate crisis or climate finance crisis, right? I was listening to a webinar on climate finance by all these finance ministers from the EU and the central bankers and so forth. And they were saying, well, one of the things of COVID is that it will make firms, including financial and other firms, begin to value risk more, right? To value risk and to be thinking about how do they manage risk. Because under COVID, they see that the need to manage risk is there. What about climate change and extreme weather events? So all of these become part of this discussion about what it is, the rule-based system, what are the standards that are being set, what are the principles and the assumptions that are being used. And we have to be mindful that in this context, in the previous context when many of these conventions were laid down, they were laid down assuming European American dominance. But now we're in another terrain where the emerging economies, China, India, and different groups of countries are saying, we want to be part of this rule of the game. We want to be part in deciding our fate. And we want to redefine some of these concepts and frameworks. And I think the COVID-19, again, you see where, again, climate change is an exogenous shock on the economy. Many developing countries did not contribute to it, but they have to adjust to it. Likewise, COVID is an exogenous shock. It's a global shock. Global supply chains have shut down, various kinds of things. And developing countries, once again, have to adjust. They have to adjust under the condition where they have severe fiscal constraints. Many of them are highly indebted. Their public system have been decimated, not because of their internal policy, but as a result of policies by the IMF and the World Bank. The very same people who are saying, no, we're going to rescue you, right? But we're going to rescue you under conditionalities. And even though they've projected grants, we can bet that as the program unfolds, those grants become conditional, or they become concessional loans, and so it builds more and more debt. So I think this whole question of global governance is really an area of high tension, and there's some things that need to be fixed. The debt situation, the investor-state dispute settlement, not tinkering at the border, but really, really addressing it. And of course, trade. Vice already flagged trade, the WTO and the plurilaterals that are going on. And all of those have to integrate issues around public health, food security, social protection, global social protection, and the global approach to migration, and all of those things that are realities of development and developing countries are reality in a situation where we're faced by climate change and these potential pandemic. I mean, I was looking at Global's Futures report, and this pandemic is one of a number of pandemics that security experts have said will be coming, right? So COVID-19 is one, and there are possibly quite a number of other ones waiting around, because we have actually, we're in that situation where the human system and natural system, and we see evidently all of this, including climate change, is linked to markets and market failure and how we address markets, right? And even the way that the stimulus packages are going, again, what is the natural tendency of these governments in these packages? Are they taking into concern from the point of view of the bottom of the country, the informal worker, the woman, or is it coming again from the top of these big corporations who themselves have very deep pockets, because they've had deep pockets for the last 10 years since the recovery. They certainly didn't need any bailout. And you see it in the US where the money has gone to the biggest companies who have tremendous resources and not the small business. So I think we have a lot of things to unpack in this global governance about the leadership in the IMF, leadership in the World Bank, leadership at all of these global setting institutions are part of the dynamics of this discussion about global governance.
Yeah, I agree with Mariama. In a way, you know, what we seem to be picking up, you know, when we hear, say, the UN or the IMF or the private sector talking about the post-pandemic recovery phase and then saying, okay, let's build back better,
Yes.
or let's go for green recovery, or focus on this, like the EU saying Green New Deal. I mean, the problem with a lot of those is they do not seem to have learned the lessons of the pandemic, because a lot of the underlying assumptions and underlying policy frameworks of those are to repeat what happened in the past. Strengthen corporate, this strengthen the ability of corporations to be part of, to be the to be in the driver's seat as far as shaping policy is concerned, to continue on with existing value chains, but then or maybe to create a much bigger a much bigger competitive advantage in a way, for economies which are looking at this green recovery, or at this build back better idea, to grab possible advantages in the future. Again, without, I think, necessarily looking at what Mariama was pointing out about, okay, what are the things that we know are needed from the bottom up, in terms of better healthcare, better public services being provided, a broader based social security safety net for everybody, a much more robust regulatory framework to regulate corporate activity, for example, in the natural environment area. Things like those. Those do not seem to be a big part of the policy responses that we are now seeing. Essentially, what many of the governments are now saying is, okay, if we talk about Build Back Better, then let's talk about carbon pricing. But we know that carbon pricing in many contexts will have disequilibrium effects, especially for the poor, because it could, so those are not being thought about or talked about very, very thoroughly. There are also issues about what kind of regulations do you put in place, and whether those regulations, for example, to advance on mitigation as part of the post-COVID recovery phase, to advance on climate change mitigation, is something that is actually going to be useful for purposes of equitable economic recovery later on. It might turn out that when you say, okay, well, we're going to channel stimulus packages post-pandemic towards only those firms or towards those industries which would do X, Y, and Z, maybe those industries will not be labor intensive. So how do you create jobs that way? So these are, as Mariam was saying, if you unpack all of these things and then sort of like layer a lot of these together, you actually realize that when you talk about global governance, they are all interlinked, and they all need to be addressed at the same time.
Yeah.
We cannot sort of like talk about, okay, we're talking about pandemic recovery just only in the economic sector without dealing with how do you build that into the what we know need to be done, for climate change, or for biodiversity protection, or for ocean conservation, things like those. And I'm not seeing what we're seeing, for example, in the United Nations, is that you have different parts of the system. Right? So you've got the Oceans Conference 2020, you've got the Biodiversity Summit, you've got climate change. All of them have been postponed. But then there are, what I'm seeing is attempts at integrating these things are still very much limited. There is recognition that you do need to sort of like link them together, but there is none. But there is very little in the way of linking them to broader macroeconomic, multilateral economic design.
Yeah. What you see, Vice, thank you for bringing that attempt at linking them. Where you actually see there is some congruence or consensus about linking all these things is about climate finance.
Yeah.
Because then the climate finance has to do double duty. It's like you can then divert from ODA, you can divert from development assistance into climate change. But you don't talk about the structural roots behind all of these things and the drivers behind them. So we could see discussion about, oh, we need to integrate climate finance into development. We need to integrate climate finance as SDG. We need all of that. Because you want to make the minimal part of contribution. Of course, one dimension of that is about the private sector. The other dimension is the scarcity of public resource. You want to make that spread over as much as possible, all of these different terrain, without coming up with more money that you need to, because these should have discrete pots of money, right? You can link some of the solutions. I'm not saying that some of the solutions won't have integrated element, but they're very distinct in terms of what you're going to do, right? For climate change, for climate resilience, for climate adaptation, versus what you're going to do nationally to create jobs and to build some. So I think we need to really unpack this BBB, build back better. Build what back better, and better for whom, and how will it serve? And I think a lot of our governments get carried away with this BBB. But it's in the end, as after the financial crisis, as after most other crises of capitalism, it will not be about systematically addressing elements in our economies that keep us dependent, and that doesn't promote economic diversification or promote. It will be more rules that binds us, more conditionalities that binds us, and not freeing of us to think about where we want to go and where we want to do within the context of the perspective of those who are most impoverished or most likely to be impacted and have been impacted by COVID, and will be impacted again. Any congruence between COVID and a natural disaster. We're now going into hurricane season in the Atlantic, and so you can see those two interlapping. So I think we do need to unpack this quite significantly.
And so I just wanted to pick up on that point about systemic coherence, because one of the things that we've kind of discussed quite a bit, if you've been following the series on conversations, is how the rules of international economic law really just constitutes like the global economy, and are deeply implicated, as you guys mentioned as well, in the conditions that give rise to these pandemics, that give rise to the inability of states to deal with pandemics, with crises, and we seem to hurtle from one crisis to another, right? Like, and then now we have this intersecting crisis, as you mentioned, Mariama. Like we're all focused on COVID because that's the kind of I suppose flavor of the month. I mean, it's really global, but there are also other intersecting crises that are coming along, and I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about, like, to ask you really about, like what these conditions, the systemic coherence about, and the relationship between these kind of fragmented systems of governance, right, at the global level, and how that has affected, like, preparedness. I mean, they could talk about this pandemic preparedness, and you kind of see that in some ways, in countries where they've had experience with SARS, with the avian flu, in the East Asian countries where, and in some African countries where Ebola has been prevalent. The infectious diseases protocols have like kicked in, so there was some lessons to be learned there, but they seem very disparate, right? And it seems very fragmented. So we had earlier on in our conversations, one of our earlier conversations, we had two global health governance experts come, talk about this kind of fragmentation in global health governance, but also wanted to relate that to kind of like, I guess in a way, Vice, you touched on this about how pandemics are really now a common issue as well, and part of the global commons, governance of global commons should really involve, looking at health epidemics and public health as a global public good in that sense. So I just wanted to kind of bring you back to kind of like, thinking a little bit about, what does the lack of preparedness or global preparations to deal with pandemics and crises in these cases, the fragmented, kind of like governance systems, what does it say in relation to our preparedness for everything else, all the other, the looming climate crisis, the oceans, the loss of biodiversity, because it's an integrated problem, as you say, and I guess I just want to put it out there and challenge you, kind of like to ask for your thoughts on this, really.
Nice. I'm still thinking.
Me too. Uh,
Well, I think
no,
preparedness is, we hear that a lot, right? And many people would say that in terms of at least one global issue, right? Climate change. Technically, we should have been prepared since almost 3 decades of negotiation, and we're still no closer to being prepared, despite the fact that every year a developing country is devastated. GDP going back to numbers that you don't see, even with COVID. In the case of Antigua and Barbuda, some islands in the Philippines and other places. And we still are not any closer to being preparedness. And in fact, at some level, before the crisis, we'll see after the crisis, we were far, far away from multilateralism than ever, with the intransigence of the US in many different quarters. And so developing countries themselves, who have always been proponents of multilateralism, because we have always needed to have that collective agreement against the interests of the bigger powers, be they who they are. But even many developing countries are getting very weary of the constant chipping away of the multilateral system and the rules that they had sacrificed. Because we have sacrificed. Developing countries and the trade rules have sacrificed quite a lot and bound themselves quite a lot for multilateralism, for a global commons issue, for all of those issues, only to find that those rules are being upended willy-nilly by different global partners, and you don't hear a big outcry, right? I mean, you hear mild statements, but if those rules had been truncated by, say, China or India or Brazil, you would have thought that they did something as devastating as COVID-19, right? So we have this level of hypocrisy among our global institutions, including some of our agencies and governments, around the stability, the coherence, the sustainability of rules that are being agreed to by all parties, and who can violate those rules with impunity and who gets punished for even smaller divergence or even asking for policy space. You're made to seem like somehow you're some radical weird mullah somehow out there asking for policy space. They're growing weary of policy space. But now we see under COVID, they're all taking their policy space, including closing their borders, right? So I think that whole discussion about how we govern ourselves and how we live is a question that comes back to us, and that many developing countries who had believed in trade rules and multilateral rules that tell them that you don't need to be food sufficient, you could buy your food from the market, are now coming to see that they can't access medicine. If the global food chain is significantly more damaged, countries will be putting on export controls on basic goods and services. Where do you import those foods from? And this is something that in the Caribbean is a big reality for us, because the U.S. has embargoed and blocked medical supplies, not just to Cuba, and they refused to let purchase goods, medical goods, leave the U.S. for the Caribbean, right? On the grounds of national security, national health. So even us in the developing countries who have sacrificed our agriculture, we haven't paid attention to our agriculture and food security on the grounds that trade will lift all boats and you just need to do comparative advantage, have to begin to rethink that in this current era, with looking down the line at climate change, looking down the line at more of these pandemics coming along. And to be able to think about regarding our farming system, regarding a lot of our basic health systems, and not count, and even putting research into our medicines and into various things that we have half-hearted put resources. So now we have to think about the limited policy space we have, the resource we have, and put them into our economies, and not so focused on exporting anymore. We need export. That's not what I'm saying. But I think we need to build a domestic economy to the extent that we can, to have people have resilience and food security. You should be able to have food security for 6 months, up to 9 months. You shouldn't after 3 weeks not have access to food or basic medicine. So those are the kinds of things I think that pre-planning now means, preparedness now means. Now, not just getting human rights assistance, but all humanitarian aid, but also thinking about what you need to set aside. We used to think that 3 months of reserves was important. Well, with COVID, 3 months of reserve is nothing, okay? So now you may have to think about 9 months, a year of reserves. You know, all of those things that we took for granted become upended with this one teeny, I would say, teeny bug, right? Because it has more devastating impact on global supply chain and trade than I think the financial crisis. I haven't looked at all the numbers yet, so I'm speaking off the top of my head. But it is a huge wake-up call for any of our governments who really have the intention to be in government and not night watchmen, which we say in the developed in Don, right? Many of our states are night watchmen. They watch the state. They they monitor. They walk around. They're not governing in the sense that we would like that. They're looking at the population and what interests of their population and doing longer term planning. And some are doing a fantastic job of it, and some are not. But I think it's a new world. Will they listen, or will we go back to build as better BB coming from the World Bank, BB coming from IMF, Europe, and the US? Is it going to be built back better for the Philippines, for Jamaica, based on our condition, and the factors that threaten us, and the state of our healthcare system, and all of those kinds of things?
Yeah. The concern here is, and I agree with Mariama on those things, but my concern is what the pandemic has shown us is that it is so easy for countries to retreat back into nationalism, right? Into my own country first. So easy. I mean, look at the EU. You know, they started, despite Schengen, they started shutting down borders and they blocked everybody, and now they have individual unilaterally. So easy. And that is a big cause for concern, because when a global crisis comes along of a scale of the pandemic, you know, which is going to happen, which is what is going to happen with climate change, with the biodiversity crisis eventually. Will we retreat back? Will governments have that reaction of retreating back, or will the reaction be the reverse, which is to, like, you know, emphasize more international cooperation and then build up your international cooperation structures that way? And unfortunately, we have not seen much in terms of that latter approach right now. I mean, we see the UN Secretary General calling for more international cooperation, and we see efforts here and there, but so far the response has been national. Now that gives us two things to think about. One is, okay, if a response to a global crisis is for countries to start looking inwards and focus more on national development, what can we as citizens or as communities and national governments themselves, especially in developing countries, do to make sure that focus inwards, whether it's on a national basis or in the case of some of our countries, on a regional basis, you know, be done in a way that actually builds resilience and you know, increases adaptability and is much more equitable, rather than simply replicating the old structures. So that's one way that's one way. The other way is, okay, if the response to a global crisis of pandemic proportions or climate change proportions is a retreat into national systems, then are there alternatives to the current, say, multilateral framework, or are there changes to the current multilateral framework that need to be put in place to actually encourage countries to go back and say, well, okay, we, you know, to this extent, maybe we can cooperate. But what are those things, and under what conditions? And what would be the role, say, for example, of improved regional integration be part of that mix? Because, you know, one of the things that might be looked at is if international cooperation does not really is not really the go-to response, given what we have seen from the pandemic. You know, it's not one of the, like, top priority policy responses that governments are going to look into. Would improved regional integration be one of those, right? And if it's improved regional integration, then what should then be the changes that need to be made in international trade regime, in international investment regime, to make sure that you're able to help national governments build up their regional mechanisms better.
And so I just want to also bring back, I think one of the things that we is interesting is that, again, this issue with systemic coherence is that when you look at the frameworks of, the kind of like more global commons governance frameworks, right, the legal frameworks, you have the issue of burden sharing, or at least on paper, there is, some principles of equitable burden sharing, which is what we were talking about, like even if we return to kind of a multilateral cooperation, right, rather than a domestic, you also need to have some sort of principles that are guiding that multilateral cooperation, right? Yeah. And I think this is where I see the highlight, the tensions that Vice, you highlighted at the start of this conversation between the different regimes of the economic regimes and also, like the broader kind of biodiversity, commons governance regime, climate change regimes, is that within those regimes, you have a different set of principles that are actually governing these kinds of discussions, which also govern the access and the use of global resources, which also then would govern the responses. Now, whether or not that is, like Mariama has so eloquently illustrated, is actually translated into actual practical effect, that's a different question altogether, right? Like, whether they do. But the issue, like principles such as common but differentiated responsibilities, principles of access and benefit sharing, in terms of the use, because those are issues that are really kind of relevant in our conversation about COVID and mitigation of COVID, containment of COVID. Vaccines, for example, when you take, if vaccine trials are conducted in the South, for example, and then DNA sequences are taken, from populations in the South, and then used as the basis of research for vaccine development, right? What is the equitable, like what does equity mean when then the South would then, cannot access these vaccines except for, at a very exorbitant cost, right? Yeah. So in that sense, I want to kind of like bring you back to some of the principles that underlie these kind of multilateral regimes in the global commons, and see, what are the underlying principles that can be brought in when we're looking at, reforming or restructuring, how we then govern the global economy in terms of the economic regimes, which there is a tension there.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think those principles are still very much evident. And I think the most basic principle that we have to really think about is equity. I mean, if you are able to build equity as a foundation for the shaping of a new integrated systemic policy, international policy framework for all of these things in the future after the pandemic, then, then that would be a good step. And what that implies is one, of course, has to realize that, again, this old trope about no one size fits all, right? I mean, that's very basic, especially when you talk about distinguishing between developed and developing countries. It has to be a key element there, and it has to also build, and part of that equity, and Mariama was pointing this out, I think, earlier as well, when she was talking about climate finance. Part of that equity aspect there is about the sharing of resources, so that those that have less in terms of resources are equipped so that they can deal with emergencies and disasters and pandemics or whatever in a much better way and in a much more resilient way by those who have the resources in the first place. Another aspect of equity, so there's three, I think, is also looking at, okay, what were the historical responsibilities that you had that gave rise to that equity argument, and here, so it's really a question of this issue of, as you were saying, the common but differential responsibility, the access and benefit sharing, special and differential treatment in the trade regime. They should and must continue to form part of any change and any post-pandemic changes we might want to put in place, or hopefully could be put in place. Because if you don't have that kind of equity framework in place, then essentially what you might have would be a regime where everybody is treated the same. Even if we know that there are severe inequalities all over the place among countries and within countries. And I think, if And if you have those kinds of like an equal treatment clause for everybody, regardless of whether they're actually able to meet the obligation or not, then that is not a fair regime in the end. Because what that means is that you are actually benefiting those that have much more resources or much more in the way of wherewithal to deal with the crisis as compared to those that have less. So I think equity is going to be a key foundational aspect. Should be it and must continue to and ought to continue to be
Yeah,
a foundational part of that.
that's for sure. Because I think if we look at the putting COVID aside, if we look at what we came out of the 20th century with and the things that we thought we would not have to deal with at the top of the century, the 21st century, poverty, inequality, gender discrimination, gender-based violence, lack of access to health care. These are fundamental rights that were codified in many UN charters and UN and human rights instruments. And yet we see that they are pervasive within and between countries. So that's why the question of equity and inequality has to be one of the foundation if we're going to build back better, both not just at national, but at the global level. And for me, one of the most instructive things about where we're going in terms of equity is on this vaccine issue. We're already seeing countries are putting their money on the table to secure their access.
Yeah.
Okay? Instead of coming together and pooling resources to have the development of vaccines. Now we have a tremendous amount of resources, both in the developed and the developing countries. We can pool those talents, but what we see is a rush. And we see different countries putting on the table, this is my money to secure my country people's access to these resources. And that doesn't bode well for the post-COVID world. Because for many of our countries are not going to have any money to put on the table, and certainly not the kind of money that the key players are willing to put up on the table. And of course, they'll grandfather a few countries in, as they always do, and they'll give a few funds to some countries and different countries, but it won't meet the needs of people. So I think that's the case in terms of thinking about green infrastructure and nature-based system, which is one of the big solutions. We also again see who is being sacrificed for green infrastructure and nature-based systems. It'll be indigenous people, it'll be women, it'll be developing countries, especially the poorest developing countries, who will have access to forests, access to water, and so forth to meet those needs. So we have to really look at this Build Back Better. Who is pushing it? What do they mean by it? Who's going to benefit and who's going to lose? Because we know that these all have those things already inbuilt in them. And so I think we have to be very, very careful about how we sign on to these mantras. We have to keep pushing and helping our governments understand and push our governments and our institutions and our people to really raise these critical questions and to think now about public health as being a foundational thing. We have seen a whole new definition of what essential workers are. So the nurses, the doctors, the teachers, and so forth, and the store clerk, all these people who are at the front of the line of the disease. So we've got to rethink some of the things that we valued prior to COVID and how we restructure that both domestically and internationally and regionally. And I do think that regionalization will take on a better and bigger role. Principled regionalization that is discussed and take into consideration the points of view of the poorest countries within the region also, not just the big ones at the top. Because we know that at the slight hint of crisis, the global things tend to fall apart. And what's left is how we deal with our neighbors. And our closest neighbors are those that we must be able to deal with. And I think from what I'm reading, and I haven't done a thorough analysis of it, the regional processes seems to have held up a bit. And certainly there's a lot of pledging at the global level. We will support you, and out of moral, but not about the structural issues. Not about from the recognition of. For me, when the World Bank says we're going to give $60 billion and we're going to give so much to Ghana, well, first it may start by saying, why is Ghana's health system so bad? because it was doing very well before the World Bank got there. So we need some accountability and some responsibility as the drivers, why it is that the developing countries will be so most negatively affected, because their systems have been devastated. And so they have to get loans to address that. These should be additional to their development drive. And so they shouldn't have to be sacrificing their development funds to meet COVID-19 or any of the other things that might come, climate change 19. And that's where CBDR and equity and in the WTO, of course, we know the US wants to get rid of special and differential treatment. And so all of the principles underlying the global governance framework have been under attack up until COVID-19. Let's see what happens post COVID-19 or in the aftermath of the immediacy of the health crisis.
So I thank you. So I mean, this is one of the things that we have been talking about over the course of these conversations is how deeply asymmetrical the impacts of this pandemic is. I mean, in a way, I guess it's showcasing, it's amplifying the existing asymmetries that are there, right? Like that we all know that exist within the system, and in another way, it's also creating new structures of asymmetries, right? In terms of who is benefiting or who will benefit from these crises. They call it the disaster capitalism. It's one issue that is really pertaining to the kind of like institutions or organizations that are just waiting to take advantage of the Build Back Better kind of narrative, right? That we're talking about. I just wanted to pick up on the point that you raised earlier on the conversation, Vice, about there are crises within crises, and I think this is quite important in terms of looking at we're talking about a health crisis here, but you guys have also worked on climate crises and natural disaster and biodiversity loss. And I wanted to link that as well to health crisis, because obviously there's this, the more that we see biodiversity loss, for example, the more we're going to see things like, prevalence of zoonotic diseases, right? As human beings come much closer to, the kind of wildlife and wildlife start, coming into contact with humans because of the loss of biodiversity, but also in terms of, climate flooding that leads to health epidemics, like cholera, et cetera. So just wanted to pick up, I guess, on the these kind of interrelated things, and we've been talking all morning about, the integration of these various issues, that we cannot see them as separate components. So just wanted to ask you to kind of talk a little bit about these kind of intersections, really.
Yeah, thanks, Celine. I think the point I was alluding to is that all of these things, as you were also pointing out, give birth to crises in themselves. For example, if you have climate-induced drought in Africa or in Latin America or in Asia, that will drive people out of their homes, and they will tend to cross borders. And if in the process of trekking through the jungle or through the desert, they picked up some diseases which were unknown before, then that creates another kind of crisis on its own. But also, looking at the interrelatedness of it together with the economic crisis, for example, the US right now, I think, is a prime example of how these are all interrelated. I think the social and economic stresses that were generated by the pandemic has heightened the inequalities and the racial divide in the US, which now has triggered a lot of this social, the societal anger that we now see in our TV screens. And the question then is, what does that do now to the pandemic response there that they're trying to You know, you have thousands and thousands of people now on the streets, very angry and very upset at how law enforcement has been done in the U.S. What does that do with respect to the pandemic response there? You know, so we most likely will see more and more of these kinds of like interrelated emergencies and disasters, like, you know, piling on top of each other. The more that we see there, I think Mariama was the one who's talking about extreme weather events. Now, so far, for example, in the Philippines, we have been lucky because we have had typhoons, but not as intense this early in the season. If the pandemic continues in the Philippines, and then we see mass evacuations taking place, and people have to go into, you know, into evacuation centers where you will not be able to put in place any kind of physical distancing. What will that do to our pandemic response, pandemic rates? I mean, that's happening now in India, right?
Mm-hmm.
They've had a couple of cyclones already. You know, so these kinds of things, which really goes back again to sort of like when governments do planning and do policy and regulations, it's a question of how do you really put in place into the minds of our policymakers and our planners, sort of like this lateral kind of thinking, where, you know, you want to trigger responses that will hit different kinds of things all at the same time, or, you know, or one stimulus will trigger different kinds of responses as well, and that's a very tough job, because a lot of the ways in which our policy making is taking place in governments and at the international level is still very much in terms of silos.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes it very difficult to think structurally and think systematically, because you want to focus just on what you know, whereas, you know, and it's very difficult. I don't know how things are going to be done in the multilateral level. You have different conversations going on finance, on trade, on investment, or on climate change and whatever, but they very seldom sort of like interrelate. And maybe the only way that actually gets it connected together is maybe at the UN, but even at the UN, they're still very much crippled, because they have the SDG framework. But what's the SDG? I mean, you know, it was politically negotiated. We don't know where the resources are going to come from to actually help developing countries to implement all of those. And implementation at the national level also leaves much to be desired as an integrative tool, right? So it's a bleak scenario, but I think it's something that we need to do, and we need to think about arising with this pandemic, because what we know now is that one crisis leads to another, unless you address the root causes that created those crises in the first place.
Yeah, but I think you're quite correct, Vice. But I think for me, the primary manifestation of COVID, at least we're clear about that in the Caribbean, is that it is not just a health crisis. It is an economic crisis, a social crisis, social development crisis. It's also about poverty. We're seeing that many of the progress made in the region, not just Latin America, but Latin America, the Caribbean, as the crisis goes. World Bank is projecting 40% poverty across that region. So all of the great work that was done on the MDGs and now SDGs. So the question is, the SDGs, I think, are imperiled. I mean, they're obviously that 2030 deadline is far from going to be met because the people at the bottom, right, the informal workers, they're not able to sell their goods and services. You've had these one-time basic things. Even in Jamaica, we've had 9,000 Jamaican dollars that was given that's not going to last but a month or two, right? The government is doing the stimulus, one eye on the stimulus and one eye on making sure it's looking good to the IMF. You cannot govern like that. Either you're focusing on recovering your economy, and the IMF must take back seat, but you cannot be trying to recover your economy and at the same time try to please the international financial system. So there's some real serious things that has to be done. I mean, emphasis on tax relief and tax credit, that does not help the poor. Okay, that might work in the developed country, but you actually need to get people cash, sustain cash that they can utilize for their living for the next 6 months, 7 months, and you need to be able to push through those things. And some of that World Bank money ought to be able to go, and government need to push for it. But how many of our governments are going to push for it like that? So that's where a lot of the education, I think, needs to go, and some of the advocacy to make sure that this money doesn't, it's, as we know, we always hear these lovely pronouncements about $100 million, $100 billion. Then when it starts getting distributed, it never arrives, or it arrives in different form that makes you more indebted. So even though they've postponed the debt for developing countries, the poorest, the new aid, to call it that way, comes with strings that actually increases and leverage the debt. So I think that's where groups like us who are working on the outside can monitor and push, you know, and sometimes the advocacy is difficult, but I think we have to bring that. We have to bring the questioning of Build Back Better. We have the questioning of how do you do fiscal policy? I mean, we're trapped in these counter-cyclical, cyclical fiscal policy, not based on the fiscal policy that's needed for each country, based on what's going on at the bottom and at the root. And what is driving? I think it's the same cause that's driving the pandemic. In terms of the spread of the pandemic, is the same causal factors that will drive climate change and other kinds of things that we see coming. They're not so different. And the response, again, I think what if maybe there's any lesson to be learned is that both rich countries and rich people inside our countries cannot hide behind their gates, right? Yeah. So you have this tendency to gated communities in my part of the world. Well, the viruses nor climate change respect borders, external, or your border internal. And so I hope that brings a new reality and a new respect for the struggles that developing countries go through. Because I think the people in places in Europe, Switzerland, and Germany and stuff have never had to deal with a crisis since World War II. And so they have a intellectual idea of what this is. But now they've had to see their own system, the best in the world, undermine, struggle to deal with a crisis. And I'm hoping that at least at the human level, give a different appreciation for what it means to live in a country on a daily basis, struggling to meet your basic needs, and then a hurricane come, and then something come, and then, you know, so I'm hoping at least at some level, this disease have touched some hearts and some minds. Yeah. And some of our hard-hearted politicians, you know who they are in UNFCCC, who are boom, boom, you must do this, you must do that. We'll realize that they have to have humility, because, you know, their economy can go like that, right? And we're all, we're different levels of degree of vulnerability, but we're all vulnerable, right? And our ability to respond. I was on a webinar the other day, and I probably got kicked out of Switzerland, where I said, the Swiss can afford to give billions of dollars of fiscal stimulus because it won't ruin them, because they have so much of our money there from all the dictators and so forth. Whereas many of our countries don't have that kind of deep pocket. But that's the situation. And we see these countries brought to their knees. Their health system, which are the best in the world, you know, brought to their knees. What say our countries? And I think we have to, all our politicians and our governments have to be very mindful of that, and always think, how do we meet the needs of the poorest of the poor? How do we give them resilience? How do we provide food, water, under these conditions and under other conditions? And the planning has to be much different.
Yeah. So in that sense, I think when we're talking about disasters and, you know, emergencies and crises, the biggest crisis still is poverty and inequality. I think, you know, because and the good thing about those things, you know, the thing that we have to understand about poverty is that they are man-made, human-made, I should say. Right? I mean, they're created by human policies created by people. And and I think that's sort of like where the yeah, silver lining comes when we try to tackle poverty as the continuing great test, in a way, greatest crisis that the world still has. Over in before even before pandemic response and recovery and before climate change, you have to deal with poverty, because unless you deal with poverty as the fundamental driver for inequality, you are in fact continuing to live with a situation in which the rich become invulnerable to crisis, and the poor become much more vulnerable. And I think that is not going to be a fair or sustainable world in the future. So, and so going back to my point about poverty, I mean, the poverty can be dealt with when we address the systemic policies, right, that underlie why poverty exists in developing countries and in developed countries in the first place. And those policies are created by humans, by us.
Yeah.
And I think it's when policymakers realize that, and that, you know, that the market is not something that is given down from the heavens. It's something that is created by us, by the laws that our governments put in place, that then you can realize that, hey, it can be changed. It can be changed because we are the ones who put it there in the first place.
Mm.
Um, and I think what the pandemic has shown us is that when there is sufficient pressure to change the system,
It changes.
you can change will come very quickly. I mean, you know,
Absolutely.
yeah. I mean, whoever thought that people would agree to be locked into their houses for months at a time, right?
And I think this is really crux. You know, the political will certainly is there. I mean, the resources came very quickly
Yeah,
like that. I
yeah,
mean, the
Yeah.
terms that accompanied those resources,
yeah,
that's a different question altogether.
yeah,
But the commitment to it was
yeah,
definitely there,
yeah,
right? When it became an issue that was affecting the privilege, that it did not
yeah,
have, you know, like it did not recognize north, south, rich, poor, that you
yeah,
could get COVID. Now,
yeah,
how you then recover from it and how you're treated for it would then depend on so many different
yeah,
factors, right?
yeah,
And so I'm just conscious that we're heading up to the time limit, and it's just been such a wonderful engagement with you guys from the Third World Network and the South Center, and of course, you know, very close to my heart, obviously, you know, being part of the TWM family before, and South Center, and I just wanted to also maybe, you know, at this final bit of the conversation to just pay a tribute to a person that we all know
Mm.
and loved,
yeah,
Martin Core, who
Yes.
was director of Third World Network and the South Center, who I think, you know, animates the way that we think
yeah,
about these intersections of the issues. I mean, he taught me a lot.
yeah,
Um, and I just wanted to kind of like really end this, you know,
yeah.
with a little, you know, like I guess a tribute to Martin in that
Indeed.
sense. So I wonder if you wanted to say a couple of words, Vice
Yeah.
and
Yeah, thank
Mariama.
you. No, in fact, I was about to say, you know, and in closing that, you know, I think the discussion here resonates a lot in terms of the discussions that I've had when I was working with Martin at the South Center, and I'm sure Mariama has had as well with him over the many years that we've worked together. And I think it always reminds me of the discussion reminded me of this I think paper that Martin actually wrote about 10 years or so ago, and he was talking about, okay, in the climate context, the imperatives are development, um, environmental sustainability, and equity. And I think sort of like that's the triangle, you know, that one has to think about when talking about these things. And I think um, he unfortunately passed away just as the you know, global pandemic was getting there. But I think he would have said that when we talk about how we recover from this pandemic, and we talk about how we then approach the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis, we have to talk about addressing what will drive inequality in the context of this crisis, and that is going to be poverty, not only in our countries, but especially in our countries, but also in developed countries. And that addressing that poverty, that you know, the very fact that we still have billions of people who do not have the basic resources, who do not have access to basic social services, is something that we all have to do and help address in our own ways. I think that is one of the biggest takeaways that I've had from the privilege of working with Martin over almost a decade. I'm really proud and happy to have worked with him there at the South Center, but also to have joined the organization that he also set up afterwards, after I left the South Center, Third World Network, which in many ways seeks to continue the ideals that he had put forward and inculcated in us. So thank you for this opportunity, Celine, to say something about Martin. Mariama?
Yeah, thank you. And I'm really, really pleased, happy even to say that we dedicate this in memory to his work. I think Martin, oh man, I can just even imagine the articles that Martin would have been churning out for the Star and papers around this. I mean, I think the severity of it and the degree to which it's locked down the global economy, okay, might have been a surprise, but the fact that we would do something like this, that we would have a virus that would create some kind of pandemic impacting the world economy, is not something that he would not have, have not thought about, have not seen. Because Martin read everything. He read all the various government security futures thing. He read popular economics. He just read everything. And I think he spanned his life between environment, starting with environment, doing economics, doing policy, building that international relations, and making sure that the voices of the South, the developing countries, had the capacity to negotiate as best as possible under any given circumstances, which is what he did with the South Center. Certainly, I know that from climate change, and I know that from trade, that a lot of the things that we have now that we take for granted is a result of some of the work that Martin did, working with ambassadors late at night at wherever the WTO was meeting. Same thing with climate change. And we are saddened, and we are bereft, because we don't have, there are not many of these intellectual giants left at a time when we need them, because we really need to reconstruct this global order. And what we're left with, and certainly in my part of the world, are technocrats. Not visionaries, not leaders who will move people. And that's what Martin was, a visionary, a leader, and a leader with compassion, a leader who thought about everything from the base of how the poorest person in a village in India or Jamaica would be impacted. And that's what you need to do to be able to govern in an equitable, just way. And to be able to lay down economic policies that will benefit, not trickle down, but that starts from the perspective of those at the bottom. And when he was at CAP, consumer, that's all about also from the bottom up, right? And South Center and others were the middle level up and down. So he's bottom up, top down, and stirring up in the middle. And that's the kind of leader we need in this time, the kind of intellectual thinking that we need in this time, that sadly I can't provide. I'm not sure about Vice, but certainly we are definitely missing that, and I don't know. We're gonna have to try real hard.
I think that you guys have provided, such an enriching, food for thought, and also ideas of how we progress and move forward. And I think Martin would be absolutely proud to see that legacy live on. I think in everybody that he's touched.
You too, Celine.
And so, yeah, I mean, I guess in some ways this episode will be dedicated in his memory. So, thank you all, for this enriching discussions. I'm sure we will go forward and discuss more and get angry and enraged, and always kind of be mindful that all of this is at the service of people who are the most marginalized and the most impoverished and the most vulnerable. That all, I guess, what it has emerged from this conversation here, I suppose, it encapsulates kind of Martin's philosophy as well, in the sense that, what is the function of global economic governance? What's the function of law? What's the function of, the kind of trading architecture? It is to enable, people to live their lives with with freedom from fear, freedom from hunger, freedom from natural disasters, and ultimately that's what we're talking about here. So thank you very much, Vice, and Mariama, for joining me today. I will, I guess, get Twitter handles. If you don't have it, I'll link to the TWN and Self-Censor Twitter handles.
Okay.
If you are going to set up one soon.
Please do. I am not a good Twitter person, so please do.
I am. I don't have Twitter either. I don't even know what the tweet looks like.
But
please link to the South Center. They would love that.
We would, yeah. So we look forward to having more conversations and more details of this podcast and all our other podcasts in the series in the credits down here. And I wanted to say a particular thank you to my wonderful IEL Collective tech people, including especially to my colleague Tara Van Ho, who will probably be editing this video.
Oh boy, I don't feel
a big shout out there. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Everyone. Yeah, bye.